Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? I hope you've been enjoying the reunion activities thus far, and that the next few days continue to be exciting and compelling as you reconnect with classmates and find new friends and colleagues and people with whom to interact at the law school over the next few days. So very nice to see you. This is a panel about the Veterans Legal Clinic. My name is Dan Nagin. I'm the faculty director of the Veterans Legal Clinic, and I am also the faculty director of the WilmerHale Legal Services Center, which is based in Jamaica Plain, where the Veterans Legal Clinic is housed. And then I'm also vice dean for experiential learning and clinical programming at the law school. And certainly while this panel focuses on the Veterans Legal Clinic, to the extent that you have questions that intersect with the general idea of clinical education and what is now called these days experiential education, I'd be very pleased to talk about that both during our panel and afterwards. Sitting to my right is Chris Melendez. Chris Melendez is an alum of the Veterans Legal Clinic and a very recent alum of the law school, having graduated just last May. And Chris was very kind to give of his time and to come to your first reunion, I guess, even before it's a year out. He's already attending a reunion event, even though he graduated in May, so I think that sets a law school record. Will share some of his experiences in the clinic. We will be joined in a little bit by Sara Schaumburg, who's a current clinic student. So she hasn't yet graduated, yet this will be her first reunion, remarkably, who's in class right now, but will come down from her class as soon as that lets out, right around the 3 o'clock hour. So we'll have one more student panelist for you. So the structure of our discussion, I hope, is interactive. My understanding is that we are being videotaped, and that if you wish not to have your question heard or to be seen on videotape, that you may wish to sit in the rear of the room, but otherwise, I've been asked to inform you that this is being videotaped, that said, I'd love for this to be something where we get to have a conversation. I don't want to talk at you until 3:15, nor does Chris. We'd like to answer your questions. We have a presentation for you, but I would suggest that if something comes to mind and you'd like us to talk about it, let us know, and we'll have a conversation.
Although I think that once we're done presenting, the video is going to stop. Is that correct? And you can, if you want to ask a question off video, you can do it then.
Thank you. And you could see how wonderful a clinic student Chris was, ensuring that his professors did not misstate, overstate, or confuse audiences, always on the ball. So I'm going to provide a little bit of history about the Veterans Legal Clinic. Before I tell you what we do and why we do it, I want to situate the Veterans Legal Clinic within the trajectory of clinical education at the law school. And as we go, if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll chat. All right, so the first thing is, where are we? We're actually based not here on campus. We're at the WilmerHale Legal Services Center, which is a community-based legal services program and clinical teaching site in the city of Boston, across the river. We're in a community called Jamaica Plain. For those of you who know the city of Boston well, we're actually only about a little less than a mile from one of the largest Veterans Administration medical centers in all of New England, which is also in Jamaica Plain. But we've been, the Legal Services Center was founded in 1979, and it was inspired by the medical school teaching hospital model. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but it's something that I'm going to return to a few times to sort of situate what it is that we do within a larger story about how we educate students to become lawyers, and thinking about how other disciplines educate their students, whether to become doctors or something else. So at the Legal Services Center, which is often called LSC for short, we have multiple clinics, each with their own practice areas. And by clinic, what I really mean is a class that combines a classroom learning experience with a hands-on lawyering experience. So every time you see the word clinic at the end of each of these entries, it means a class where students are getting academic credit, they're being graded, but the grade isn't based necessarily on a final exam. It's based potentially on a hearing or a trial or a negotiation or a drafting or something like that related to the practice area. So at the Legal Services Center, We have a consumer protection clinic or a predatory lending clinic. We have a post-foreclosure eviction defense clinic, which is really a way of saying that it's a housing clinic that focuses on the rights of persons who are living in properties that have already been foreclosed upon. We have a family law domestic violence clinic where students are representing victims and survivors of domestic violence in order of protection cases, divorces, custody cases, visitation cases, property disputes, and so forth. We have a disability benefits clinic where we're representing low-income community members who are unable to work because of a disability and need supports from the Social Security Administration in order to subsist. Our newest clinic is the Federal Tax Clinic, which provides representation to low-income taxpayers who have tax controversies with the IRS. And the clinic handles cases all the way from the agency level at the IRS all the way up to federal court and district court. So the clinic is not simply filing tax returns. That's not what they do. Rather, they're litigating cases against the IRS, and it's a really exciting and interesting clinic that we just started in the last year. And then we have the Veterans Legal Clinic, which is what will be our focus today. So let me talk a little bit about our lineage, and then I'll also return to talk a little bit about the teaching hospital model that Gary and Jean founded. And so Gary and Jean, who are those people? Gary Bello may have been your professor at some point, or you may know of Gary in some form or fashion. Gary was a real trendsetter in public interest advocacy and legal education. Came to the law school, I think, in 1973 from the West Coast, where he had been teaching at the University of Southern California. He's a graduate of the law school. And he really started and energized and created incredible momentum here at the law school for clinical legal education. And his wife, now his widow, Jean Charn, was his co-conspirator in this, if you will. And they blazed a real trail in clinical education, not just here at the law school, but in setting an example for law schools across the country. And Jean continues to teach at the law school. So in 1979, Gary and Jean created what at the time they called the Legal Services Institute. And their idea was that medical schools had a real insight that law schools needed to think about carefully, which is no person can go to medical school and leave with an MD and not have treated a patient. Medical school students don't simply sit in classrooms learning about biology, learning about surgery through lecture and exam, but they actually do those kinds of things. They interact with patients. And that one of the best ways to learn something is not just to listen and then to study and then to watch, but also to do, and to do the real thing. So that was part of their inspiration in creating a public interest law firm in the city of Boston that would provide a setting for law students to do hands-on lawyering for credit as part of the law school curriculum. Not as a requirement, but for those who had such an interest. The second part of their model, and this also goes to the teaching hospital model, was an imperative towards public service. Gary and Jean knew well that many, many people in our communities have no access to representation. Many, many low-income people have no way to fight against a credit card company when they may not owe the money claimed. Gary and Jean knew that a woman who's running away or seeking to escape a domestic violence situation and needs to get a divorce may not have the funds to hire an attorney to represent her in a case seeking an order of protection and a divorce and custody of the children and so forth and so on. I could keep going, eviction defense, and on and on. So their model was to combine those two imperatives. One is educational, which is to provide students the opportunity to do the hands-on lawyering as a teaching tool, with an imperative towards public service, which is to close the justice gap. And their idea was, rather than trying to get the clients to come to the ivory tower of the law school from across the city of Boston to seek help, to go to where the client is, to go to where the community is. And so they situated the Legal Services Institute, later renamed the Center, in Jamaica Plain, which has gone through a lot of changes over the years. But for those of you who know Boston, is an area where there's a tremendous amount of unmet need, and it's also adjacent to other communities with a lot of poverty, such as Roxbury and Mattapan. So Jean and Gary are our founders, if you will, and their inspiration about a teaching hospital model is very much what we continue with today. Just to give you a little sense of geography, this is a map of the city of Boston. It's a very unusual map, as you can see, the various kinds of strategies and annexations that have yielded the current map that is the city of Boston. Allston-Brighton, you can see in the top left, is where the business school is located, and that borders the Charles River. But Jamaica Plain, Roxbury, where we're located right on the border, is really in the heart of the area. And if I were to overlay this map with a map of census districts with high poverty levels, we're very much in the heart of the center of the city, so that the low-income communities we seek to serve have ready access to us. We began in this building long before I was there, obviously. This is 1979, 1980. This was the very first building of the Legal Services Center, then called the Legal Services Institute. And maybe just, has anyone ever been to the Legal Services Center Institute? Probably not. Yes, you have. And what brought you there, if I can ask? Wonderful, wonderful. So we should trade seats, perhaps, because I was never at this site and did not teach.
Not at this site, at the current one.
Okay, excellent, wonderful.
Then I was transferred here to the law school when poverty struck the law school, and they brought a bunch of the units back here.
So you will have much to add to the story we are telling. So this was the very first location in Jamaica Plain, and eventually we graduated, if you will, to this building with the generous support of the WilmerHale law firm in 1993. And so it's a beautiful building that's in the heart of Jamaica Plain, about 2 blocks from the border with Roxbury, and we're right next to the subway stop, what we call the T-stop in Stony Brook, so that clients who don't have cars have a really easy time getting to us. The entire building is fitted for student work and student interaction. So these are student carols on our second floor where the Veterans Legal Clinic is based, and each student can have his or her own carol, or sometimes they share with other students. And then we have an array of client interview rooms on the first floor. And as you can see, there's a lot of open space, which really encourages students to interact and talk to each other. And so we have a wonderful clinical teaching space. The other thing about our location, and this is a picture of an extraordinarily tall person and a regularly sized female student, is this is walking back from a client meeting, a student and me. We're walking back, and this is about a block from our building in the Legal Services Center. And the building behind us, that large concrete structure from the brutalist tradition of architecture, that's a public housing complex for the elderly and disabled, which is a block and a half from our building. So by being in Jamaica Plain, we can be very accessible to the people who don't have access to representation, the people who can't afford attorneys. And we were working with a household where there had been a veteran living there who unfortunately passed away, and we were working with the family on a case, and they can come to us easily and we can get to them easily. So let me pivot and talk a little bit about the Veterans Legal Clinic and why we do what we do. And I'm going to start with our pedagogical goals. And then I'm going to turn in a moment to our service goals. And that's going to be a theme throughout our discussion this afternoon. If we think back to the teaching hospital model that Gary and Jean envisioned, you're doing 2 things at once. You're providing a compelling and unique learning opportunity for students, also doing good in the world. You're also trying to close the justice gap in any way you can. And so when I talk about the Veterans Legal Clinic, I'm going to talk about why we teach what we teach, but then we're also going to talk about what we hope to accomplish in terms of public service for the community of veterans who need representation and advocacy. So the clinic was founded in the fall of 2012. So we're a pretty young clinic. We've only been around for a couple of years, but with the incredible energy and creativity and enthusiasm and talent of students who are the driving force of the clinic, Chris is an exemplar of that. We've been able to do a lot in a short amount of time, but why did we want to create a Veterans Legal Clinic? What was the imperative? So let me walk through that a little bit with you. So one factor is that the recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan which are not in our rearview mirrors. They continue to this day in many ways. The burdens of those conflicts fell on relatively few people as compared to earlier eras, such as especially World War II, but even the Vietnam era where the draft was in place. Relatively few people served in the Iraq or Afghanistan wars, or both, compared to the overall population. And very few families were touched by war. But war, of course, affects us all, and the country's decision to go to war is as important a decision as this country ever makes. And it was vital, we think, given the law school's place in discussing the most important issues of the day, that we take seriously as an institution the notion of war and its impact on people and on the home front. So one perspective was to help ensure that as we train students, that they have the opportunity, if they're interested, that we make it available. It's certainly not a requirement for graduation, but an opportunity to understand, appreciate the needs and sacrifices of disabled veterans. Another element, and this really goes hand in hand with the first, is to bridge the civilian and military divide. And this goes to the first point I was raising. So few Americans know someone in their family who fought in Iraq or Afghanistan, or have a close friend who did. It's a dwindling number of people who are connected to those who serve. And that is just a fact today. But that also means that there's work to be done in terms of educating each other, both for those who have served to educate civilians, but also for the civilians to educate the veterans about the civilians' perspective on these questions. And so we want to bridge that divide. And maybe divide is too strong of a word, but one thing that's really important to me in our clinic is we do not screen students. We have no application process. There's no requirement that you be a veteran. There's no requirement that you be a non-veteran. If you're interested, we'd like you to sign up, and if you're not interested, don't sign up. But every semester when we have a mix of students, some civilian and some veteran, which we have every semester, that's the best mix. That's the best kind of conversation, where the students who are veterans may be well positioned to talk about their perspective, their experiences to the extent they want, and so can the non-veterans, to talk about myths that we may have, and challenges and questions that we may have where we have multiple perspectives. And at the same time, no two veterans are alike. There's incredible diversity within the veterans community in terms of politics and experience and values. And the same is true in the civilian context. And one of the things we're trying to teach is the diversity of viewpoints and not to paint with too broad a brush. The third pedagogical goal was to immerse our students in a legal services public interest setting. And that term, immerse, is really, really important. That's why we're a self-contained public interest law firm, so that when students come to us, they're not merely coming to a workspace or a cubicle. They're coming to a culture where we're working as hard as we can every day to help as many people as we can every day. And we have to balance priorities and decide which cases to take and balance a deadline in this case with a new intake over here in another case. And we have to think about that. As opposed to giving students a very small sliver of a big case, we want to give students a lot of opportunities to work on multiple cases, but also to interact with other students who are balancing responsibilities too, so that they can really embrace the ecosystem of a public interest law practice setting. Now, of course, one thing we're also trying to do, perhaps the most important thing, is to develop lawyering skills. And so the students are working on real cases, and this goes to the idea that the best way, or one of the best ways to learn how to do something is to do it. And so students are working on complex matters, many involving administrative law, many in state and federal court, and we want to give students the opportunity to go argue before a judge, to take a deposition, to draft interrogatories, to interview a client, to engage in settlement conversations with a talented, high-powered, well-prepared adversary. We want students to have those opportunities because they can take it with them as they enter their careers and build their toolkit as a lawyer. Even if they don't end up litigating cases, no matter what they go do, whether they enter public policy or government or the corporate world, that those are skills they can take with them and use in some way. One other facet of our educational goal, and this relates to the word disabled at the very top, because we're primarily working with disabled veterans. Those disabled veterans are also getting care from doctors, some of whom are psychiatrists, some of whom are cardiologists, some of whom are oncologists, some of whom are social workers, some of whom are vocational rehabilitation experts. So because our clients are working with other disciplines, as we develop and work on cases, we also need to work with those specialists. And that's a really, really valuable tool, we think, and animated our thinking in the founding of the clinic. Because as this generation of law students goes off to the world, more than ever, disciplinary boundaries are being broken down. And lawyers have to interact with economists. They have to interact with healthcare professionals. They have to interact with experts across multiple domains. And so one of the things that we're really excited about in our clinic is that it is very hard to get through a semester in our clinic and not have spoken to an expert witness of some kind or another, or a treating provider of some kind or another, to step outside the law and have to partner with someone to accomplish a common goal. The two last points really go in tandem. One of the most interesting and challenging aspects of veterans law, and I haven't even told you what veterans law even means. Don't worry, we will get there. I will tell you what cases we actually work on and what this means to say we have a veterans legal clinic. But I first want to talk about our philosophy, is that it is a very new area of law. I'll give you one example. Many people have read or heard about the veterans benefits backlog at the VA. It's been on the front page of the Times and the Post. It's got a lot of coverage. Those backlogs involving benefits, those are veterans seeking compensation from VA for war-related injuries. And VA is experiencing extraordinary challenges making timely and accurate decisions. It has not been going well, although it's marginally better recently. Until 1988, all decisions of VA regarding whether a veteran is or is not eligible for benefits were immune from judicial review. VA stood in what people now call a period of splendid isolation. By statute, VA was insulated completely from any kind of court review of individualized decisions or even group decisions. And it wasn't until Congress interceded after a tremendous political battle in the late 1980s was judicial review of agency action created, which finally made VA subject to some kind of outside oversight, not just political oversight, but judicial accountability. So we're not that far away from 1988. The court that was created, a federal court to review VA decisions, has only been around since 1990. So the body of law regarding one part of what we do, veterans benefits, is still very young, and there are immense gaps. So advocates have a tremendous opportunity to create change because the law is very much underdeveloped. So that's another aspect that's driving us. And so because the law is underdeveloped, if you will, there are tremendous opportunities for law reform. And we can come up with new ideas and creative strategies to try to move systems in new directions when those systems are broken. The other thing related to these kinds of new opportunities, and I'll take a moment to welcome to the panel Sara Schaumburg, who is a current Veterans Legal Clinic student. Thank you, Sara, for making your way down here. Is that in the same way that the Pentagon has encountered unexpected challenges as it has fought 2 wars abroad, related to environmental toxins, related to Gulf War syndrome, related to what are called the invisible wounds of war, post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. Those experiences are pushing medicine and environmental science in new directions about how we care for those when they come home after fighting in war. And there are all kinds of new questions and challenges in science and other disciplines about how we care for our wounded veterans when they come home. So this has implications in law too, of course. And so it is very important for lawyers and for Harvard Law School to be part of the conversation about these areas as they change and we learn new things. So now I'm going to get to the second imperative. I'm going to switch from talking about our pedagogical goals and talk about our community service goals, and I'll return to some of the themes that I mentioned earlier. So one is that veterans are a relatively small and actually shrinking percentage of the overall population, about 7% of the overall population. Recall what I had mentioned earlier, that veterans, that most people have been, and I put it in quotes because everyone is affected, but unaffected by recent wars. Individual families haven't necessarily borne the burdens of war, except in the most diffuse way. In Massachusetts, we have nearly 400,000 veterans. 30% of those veterans live at or near the poverty level. About almost 100,000 veterans in Greater Boston live at or below or just above the poverty level. So there's an immense need for advocacy and help, and lawyers have a role to play in that because so many of the problems and issues that veterans face have a legal component, that we can fill that justice gap. That just as we teach students skills that they must have and values we want to inculcate, we can also help close the justice gap. And related to that, and this goes to a point that I raised earlier about the unique needs of veterans, just because you understand administrative law in some generic way doesn't mean that you understand veterans benefit law and that you can advocate skillfully for a veteran. The world of veterans law is highly, highly specialized, and only by digging in with real cases and real experiences and real clients can someone understand the system from the inside out, and which has long-term benefits, not just if a student may go on to a career where they'll do pro bono work for veterans or speak out for veterans or pursue a public interest career on behalf of veterans, but when they think about systems and government and policies and what works and what doesn't work, there are very important lessons that can be taken to other areas of practice. So one of the things when we think about veterans is we think about poverty, but there are other aspects to the specialized world of the veterans community that require us to think about specialized lawyering skills. So about 30% of homeless men are veterans. Now remember, 7% of the overall population in the country is veterans, but 30% of homeless men are veterans. So you see tremendous overrepresentation of veterans within that disadvantaged population. I'm going to pause here for the moment and offer a quick caveat before I go through the rest of these stats, which is one of the things that we want to do is to demystify assumptions about the veterans community. And yes, veterans do face specialized challenges related to homelessness and also to psychiatric issues related to their service. But no one should assume for a moment that that somehow means all veterans have those challenges or all veterans live at or near poverty. Far from it. In some measures, veterans compare very favorably in terms of economic status in relation to the overall averages in our country. So for example, just as veterans are overrepresented among the population of the homeless, so are veterans overrepresented in the population of Fortune 500 CEOs. And so what we're trying to attack is not necessarily a crisis that every veteran will face, far from it, but those who have particular challenges who then have a real domino effect in their lives as they try to live with stability and dignity. 10% of veterans discharged after 9/11 have received what's called a less than honorable discharge. And what that means is, and some of you may be veterans in the room, and can I pause for a moment? If anyone is a veteran, would you be willing to raise your hand? Thank you for your sacrifice and service. One of the things that has become increasingly true in the post-9/11 era is that it is easier and easier for someone leaving the service to be given something other than an honorable discharge. When you leave the service, just like when you leave a job, your employer puts something in the file that says this was a good employee, eligible for rehire, or a bad employee, not eligible for rehire. The military does something like that with a discharge, indicating whether a person has an honorable discharge, but some people receive a less than honorable discharge. And that less than honorable discharge serves as a scarlet letter that will follow that veteran around and prevent the veteran potentially from getting access to VA healthcare, VA benefits, job preferences, housing. In some instances, that less than honorable discharge was earned, and that was potentially the right outcome for that veteran because of some kind of misconduct in service. However, for too many veterans, the reason they received a less than honorable discharge was not because they engaged in some tremendous error of judgment without explanation. It's because they had PTSD and they weren't themselves. And they may have done something or found themselves in a situation they didn't anticipate, where they may not have responded in the way they would have wanted ideally, but it was because of their disability or the stresses of deployment or multiple deployments that someone may have found themselves in a situation and ended up with a less than honorable discharge that now serves to close doors everywhere they turn when they come home, without any possibility of fixing the problem, although our clinic and many other clinics are working to change that through petitions for discharge upgrade, which I'll talk about in a moment. So another specialized area is advocating for veterans who may have a less than honorable discharge, when that wasn't the appropriate designation given the circumstances. Another specialized area to think about the veterans community is the invisible wounds of war, and that is the term to describe the constellation of disabilities that a veteran may have that you cannot see, all right? There is the notion that you might see a veteran with a prosthetic, and you say, well, that person was exposed to some kind of explosion or some kind of a combat situation, and that veteran lost a leg, and now that veteran has a prosthesis, and you can see the disability. More and more, however, the injuries that veterans are coming home with, although those kinds of injuries I just described obviously still occur tragically, are veterans who come home with injuries you cannot see. Post-traumatic stress, or what also is called, or a different diagnosis, although the symptoms can sometimes be similar, traumatic brain injury. And as science advances in those areas, we're understanding more and more how serious those conditions are and how important it is to treat them just like any other wound of war. So over 30% of Vietnam War era veterans have PTSD. About 20%, and these are estimates of Iraq War veterans have PTSD, a slightly lower number for the Afghanistan War. And about 10 to 20% of Iraq War veterans have traumatic brain injury. So these are all areas where, again, you see that crossover between law and science, where we have to understand.
What is traumatic brain injury?
Traumatic brain injury means, a concussion is an example of a traumatic brain injury. It is a situation in which the brain, encased as it is in a protective skull, experiences some kind of either impact or blow in force that affects the brain's functioning. And traumatic brain injury, just like in a concussion situation, and a concussion is an example of that, there are different gradations or severities of traumatic brain injury. Some people may have relatively modest or minor TBI, and they may recover within a matter of 4 or 5, 6 months after a period of being dizzy periodically, of not having their bearings, of not being able to sleep right, of experiencing ringing in their head and having other kinds of symptoms, and then they go away. Other people have severe traumatic brain injury, and it affects them long-term in very, very profound ways, and there are lots of people in between. A lot of traumatic brain injuries occurred because of the use of improvised explosive devices, for example, in Iraq, where convoys or other units on patrol would experience an explosion. Sometimes that explosion killed people. Sometimes that explosion wounded people. Some of those wounds might be physical wounds, but other wounds might be traumatic brain injury. Sometimes if you were merely close to the explosion, it may result in TBI, even if you weren't hit with shrapnel or some other kind of material coming your way. The last thing I'll mention about specialized issues, and as I go, I encourage questions. So if there's anything you'd like us to explore in more detail, please go ahead and ask. And I would also encourage, to whatever extent Sara and Chris would like to jump in with any of the questions to supplement my answers, please do so. Is military sexual trauma, often just referred to as MST. Military sexual trauma can take many different forms. It can range from sexual harassment on the job in the military to a sexual assault, or both. And military sexual trauma is the umbrella term to describe this phenomenon, which essentially went unrecognized except by its victims, unremedied, not given any kind of attention until the last decade or so, and then much more intensely in the last few years. About 25% of women veterans report experiencing military sexual trauma at some point. And this is a profound problem, not just because of the victims involved, but it also undermines the ability of the military to do its job. So it has tremendous dimensions. It's very complicated and yet incredibly important, because it essentially went without any kind of official attention or concern until very recently. Now, interestingly and importantly, even though 25% of women veterans experience military sexual trauma, the same number of male and female veterans have experienced military sexual trauma in sheer numbers and raw numbers. So how could that be? How could it be that 1 in 4 women serving in the military experience military sexual trauma, but an equal number of male veterans have experienced military sexual trauma. I'm sorry? Yes. The military historically has been a male institution. And so men experience MST just as much as women do, but I shouldn't say just as much. The sheer number is just as much as the number for women who are victims. But because the military has been traditionally more male, the numbers are about equal. So this isn't just a problem where women are victims. Men are victims too, and the perpetrators can be men or women, depending on the circumstances. Although obviously women, as just in terms of risk factors, are much more likely to be the victim. So just to pause for a moment and think about female veterans. While historically the military has been predominantly a male institution, that has already changed and will change even more, so that by 2040, the percentage of the women veteran population of the overall population will be close to 18%. So one of the things we do in our clinic is we really pay attention to this question. And we serve a number of women veterans who have specialized needs. And we have a number of cases, some of which I'll touch on in a little bit, related to military sexual trauma issues. Let me talk a little bit about system failures, and then I'll make sure that I'll pick up my speed a little bit to make sure that I give sufficient time for my colleagues here to chime in. I mentioned earlier the backlog at VA that many of you may have read about in the news. That is something that we as a clinic think a lot about and think about potential responses. These photos are photos of the VA regional office in North Carolina, where claims were still very recently only being evaluated on paper, not electronically, where they did not have sufficient staffing and systems to ensure the prompt review of applications so that veterans could get quick and accurate decisions, and where a backlog grew. And the backlog grew so much that the files were piled on top of files, that the flooring in the building started to give way, and the building stopped being structurally sound because of the weight of the files. So when we think about advocacy for veterans, we're thinking about some big, big challenges that are not just on an individual basis, but they also reflect some system failures. And I'll talk a little bit about those system failures and the role that our students play in helping us think about responding to those. So finally, what do? We represent clients in individual cases, and we also engage in targeted systemic reform initiatives. We do a lot of community outreach and engagement to ensure that we're connecting to people who need our help. We work with other disciplines as often as possible and as appropriate, and we also want to foster discussion and expertise about veterans' law and policy. So let me become even more concrete. What kinds of cases do we do? Please tell us finally. Veterans Benefits Project, we're divided into 2 different projects in our clinic. One engages in litigation related to veterans benefits, and we handle appeals primarily in federal court, although periodically at the agency level, on behalf of veterans who are seeking VA benefits for a disability related to their service and have been denied. And we take those appeals to a specialized Article I federal court called the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. That was the court that Congress created in the late 1980s that for the first time opened up VA to judicial review. We also do the same thing for Massachusetts veterans benefits. Our Commonwealth has a very robust program of veterans benefits, but it too sometimes doesn't function in the way it is supposed to, and sometimes, and too often, veterans are denied when they ought not to be, and we represent veterans in appeals to challenge those wrongful denials. So these are all cases in which veterans are seeking either compensation, money, for war-related injuries, or they're seeking access to health care. And when those systems unlawfully deny them, our students are representing them in appeals before agencies and in federal court. Our last area of practice in the Veterans Benefit Project is discharge upgrade cases. These are the cases I mentioned before where a veteran may have received a less than honorable discharge. There is a mechanism to petition the Armed Forces Tribunals. There's one for the Navy and Marines, Army, Air Force, and Coast Guard, where a tribunal convened by the military will review a case after someone has already left the service to consider whether to change any of the designations or language in their discharge paperwork so that someone can get a fresh start. And so that's another area of very important practice. And then we have a very different area of practice, but we think it really complements what we do in the Veterans Benefit Project, which is we do estate planning. We work with a lot of low-income veterans who may not have a healthcare proxy in place, who may not have a power of attorney at all, who may not have a living will or declaration of remains, who don't have a will at all, whose only asset may be a home, a small, modest home in a working-class neighborhood, and they have no plan for what's going to happen to that home. Or they have children, and they're suffering from, that is, the veteran is suffering from a chronic or terminal illness, and there's no plan for who will care for the children if the veteran passes away or becomes incapacitated. So our estate planning project works with veterans who have all of these needs, and the goal is to provide stability and dignity. And just as all of us need to have these kinds of documents in place, no matter our age and no matter our health, so too for a low-income veteran, especially because of the rate of disability and chronic and terminal illness or injury. So some people think it's odd. Estate planning is just for wealthy people. But estate planning and having these critical documents in place is a really important component of ensuring that someone has stability and security and has maximum control over decision-making regarding financial or healthcare decision-making. The other thing that we really like about estate planning, and this goes back to the slide about our teaching goals, is some students don't want to learn how to litigate. And that's fine. So much of the world happens outside the courtroom. So much of the world involves transactional work. And so the estate planning project allows us to provide those students with those kinds of interests and the ability to do something meaningful, to learn really valuable skills that will transfer well and also meet an unmet need. Now, certainly the estate planning project will sometimes go to court, in probate court, and deal with guardianships and conservatorships, but their primary work is transactional in nature. We also do community engagement. This is a photo of some law school students, and you'll even see Chris in the background with his sunglasses on, standing next to me, and other colleagues from the law school and students and staff from the Legal Services Center who went to an event called Stand Down, where in tents set up by the National Guard, we provided free legal assistance to homeless and at-risk veterans. We do that every summer. We also have met with others who are interested in the needs of service members and veterans. This is the clinic meeting with an Army Reserve JAG unit to discuss the needs of returning service members. I talked about other disciplines. We have what's called a medical legal partnership with the home-based program of Massachusetts General Hospital, where one of our lawyers is deployed, if you will, to Mass General to hold clinic hours in a program that serves post-9/11 veterans who have post-traumatic stress or traumatic brain injury, with a specific focus on finding clients who have less than honorable discharges so that we can assist them. We also do trainings for veterans and legal workshops. Sara's going to do one in a couple of weeks at the Legal Services Center, and she's looking at me saying, I am? I didn't know that I am. You are. Where we provide legal education workshops for everyday people, veterans, so that we can demystify the law and help them identify their own legal issues and know when to seek help. And we call the program the People's Law School. We also have discussion and debate around veterans law and policy. Last year we had the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Robert McDonald, come to the law school and speak. We also have panel discussions on the benefits backlog and other related topics. I'm going to pause here and zoom out and talk for a moment about teaching philosophy, and then I will head towards the finish line and ensure that my colleagues can speak some and that you can also ask questions. So I want to talk a little bit about our teaching philosophy in more detail. This is where Sara and Chris, you can disagree whether any of this is working, by the way, and whether we're really doing this in an effective way. This is what we try to do. It's not a science, but this is some of our thinking about teaching in a clinic. So one of our primary goals, and I would say the primary goal, is to have our students have opportunities to exercise judgment. That's what we want them to do. Our students are not interns. They are not assistants. They are not paralegals to the real lawyering done by me or a colleague. They're taking the lead on the cases. And when it's time to make a decision in a case, How are we going to respond to the settlement offer? Should we raise this argument or not? Do we need a new expert opinion? Is our client ready for the hearing? Certainly we train our students. Certainly we guide them. Certainly we serve as a sounding board and safety net. But when the time comes to make any decision, the student must make the decision. And that is because the best way to learn how to exercise judgment, which is what lawyers do, ideally good judgment, is to do it. Not to talk about judgment, not to watch other people exercise judgment, although there's certainly value in that, and not to kind of pretend to exercise judgment in a simulation, but to do it with a real client whose real life stakes hang in the balance. And so judgment is really important to us. We also want to give feedback, however. The students are not working in a vacuum. Our job is to serve as a safety net and sounding board and to provide feedback for students about how they're doing, how they're progressing, blind spots they may have. The students work in teams sometimes, but also individually. Every student who comes through the clinic will at some point work in a team because life today is full of teams and we want to expose students to that kind of opportunity. The thing that I would leave you with about our teaching philosophy is when a student is going to sleep the night before a hearing, we want them worried about the case. And I mean that in a good way. Not because they're unprepared, not because we want students to worry, not because we want to raise anxiety. We want them to know that it's their work that's on the line because that's what real life is like. And not to have their big worry is, don't forget to bring the binders for Dan because Dan's going to do the hearing. And all I have to do is remember to bring the binders. No, it's the other way around, okay? One of the best things about veterans law is that it intersects with so many other areas. Disability law, constitutional law, administrative law, health law, on and on and on, military law. And it's one of the most fun and interesting things about this practice area is you never know where it will lead because we're representing a population, a community, and their needs are so diverse. I've talked a lot about these skills, and so I'm going to keep going, but everything, soup to nuts, client interviewing all the way to hearings and appeals and everything in between. Lots of opportunities to work with clients. Student experiences include everything from initial intake to arguing in federal court. You may see Chris in the back here. This is a picture of him interacting with federal court appellate judges right before he was in chambers. He went out to go argue this case about 5 minutes after this photo was taken. We've had some incredible successes in the clinic, and we look forward to more. Some of them have created new legal precedents that have protected the rights of lots of veterans, thousands of veterans, one of which Chris helped create in a case called Osmer to create new exceptions for appeal deadlines for multiple deployed veterans. Another case called Froyo involving access to justice. Just this semester, we filed a class action against our state veterans agency related to due process rights in a case called Pouch v. Urena. We've also done lots of policy advocacy. Here are a few examples, and they range in all kinds of cases. I won't read through this slide. I'm going to keep going to ensure I leave enough time for Chris and Sara, but this just gives you a sense of the diversity of experiences our students have. I can tell you that this morning, 2 of Sara's colleagues in the clinic conducted a settlement negotiation with counsel for the Secretary of VA in a case in federal court. And the students did the entire settlement conference. And that's a weekly or semi-weekly occurrence. Something is happening in the clinic, a hearing, a settlement, a filing of a complaint where the students are doing the work and creating the outcomes. And it's really inspiring. And the students worked up the case. We got a favorable settlement for our client who's a victim of military sexual trauma, whose claim was denied by VA, and the federal court is going to now vacate that adverse decision and remand it back to the agency. And it wasn't because of an argument I dreamed up. It was because the students worked the case. They did the settlement conference with our training and support and guidance, but the outcome, they own it. It is theirs, and they can always take that with them. The work is complicated. It's demanding. It's an uphill battle. There are too few resources and too many people who need help. The one thing that I'll leave you with, because it's a recurring question in our clinic with which we wrestle sometimes, and this is the last slide before I turn it over to Chris, is you saw the slide involving the backlog of benefits claims at VA. You heard me talk about the enormous challenges as science and war and law collide, and we think about a new generation of veterans. Many of the systems on which veterans depend at VA, but in other places as well, even in state government, are not working well. And some would argue they're failing miserably. And so the question becomes, if the administrative state, if the modern administrative state fails veterans, what does that say about our system more generally and about the supports we intend to provide those in need? If we can't do right by veterans, what does it say about other communities in need? And that's a really important question. And one of the things we want to leave with our students is, what is the role of lawyers in responding to this problem? What should the role of lawyers be? So I will end there, and I will turn it over to Chris. And Chris, would you like me to pose some questions, or would you like to be able to just talk? I'm thinking the latter.
I have the ability to talk.
Okay.
I have the ability to take questions, so please fire away as you see fit. Like Dan said, I am Chris Melendez. I am a veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan, and an alumni of the law school, alumni of the clinic. All things that I'm very proud of. Just to say a word about Professor Nagin, I've seen this PowerPoint about 6 times. Every single time it gets better. Every single time I'm impressed by your understanding of the veterans community, being a non-veteran, and your advocacy thereof. So I just wanted to say thank you and mention my support of everything you've just seen. So I'm just going to talk, hopefully for a little bit, and give Sara some time to talk about how I got to the clinic and some thoughts I have about clinics in general and how they help me and how they help other students in a variety of ways. So when I got to Harvard Law School, I didn't know what a clinic was. I was told about it in your interview meetings. Why do you want to come to Harvard Law? Do you want to come for clinics? So what's that? I thought medical schools did that. It wasn't even on my mind. So I kind of fell into the Veterans Legal Clinic. I fell into it for obvious reasons. Veterans are my family, my friends. They're people I know. They're people I connect with automatically. And so I did that. And I instinctively decided I'm going to do more than just a semester. I'm going to do at least a year. It ended up being on and off probably the last 2 years with the clinic. And that's something I highly recommend for other students as well. To talk to you about some of the things I experienced in the clinic, on my very first day, I interviewed a client. I met with him, tried to navigate the ethical and professional guidelines for meeting a brand new client in the Veterans Clinic on my day one. After 5 months of training, I argued successfully Osmer v. Shinseki, which is a precedential case at a federal appeals court answerable to the Federal Circuit. And 2 years later, I'm presenting to alumni panels. So these are things that I'm able to do because I had excellent oversight, excellent support, because I was always checked and given good advice, and because Professor Nagin and other professors at the clinic, it's an excellent clinic, made sure that I knew what I was doing, that I rehearsed, that I had the skills and the support and the oversight and supervision that I needed. And I think those are things that any great teacher, great mentor is aware of and contributes. But it's also, I think, important because, especially compared to law firms and the way other public interest firms work, it can be kind of surprising that you can have a brand new law student argue a federal case after 5 months. My answer, I think, is that I didn't really do it all by myself or even close. But nonetheless, I got to do a lot and I learned a lot. And I contributed to a client's life, and I think we kept the ethical imperative to meet the client's needs first in sight as well. And so all those things were satisfied, and I think excellently done. And I think that's been a fabulous experience for me. It's been a fantastic experience for my professional life, for my ability to do pro bono work after law school, for the things I achieved while I was in law school. And I just can't say enough about how successful it was for myself and for hopefully veterans in the Boston area and in some cases nationwide. I'll give you some brief thoughts about clinics in general. I know we're talking about the Veterans Clinic today, but I think clinical education is an issue that the law school is discussing, that alumni are discussing. Certainly 30, 40 years ago, I don't know when the Cravath model was predominant. You would have people graduate law school and especially at Harvard, you're pretty sure you're going to get a job as an associate. You're going to have training at a law firm. You're going to be there for several years. well paid and be able to satisfy your school loans. And from there on, be able to move into a career in whatever your field ends up being. Today, the legal market is changing. There's less money in law firms. There's a lot more competition. And you can see that in the decrease in the number of associates firms are hiring, and yet the increase in the number of laterals firms are hiring. And so the demand for law student graduates with legal skills, real practical skills, is growing. It's immense. It's important. And I think Harvard is at the forefront of developing those skills. And I think that's been an excellent development, and it's been excellent for me as well. There's another dimension to this, is that I'm working in a law firm in a typical big law finance department. There's also public interest students who come here and they want to work for veterans, for disability. They want to work in the government. They want to work at agencies or firms that don't have the kind of money that big law has. And when those firms don't have the money that big law has, they don't have the money to train students the way big law can train new associates. And so having clinical education, having excellent quality clinical education, gives students the opportunity to go into those firms, go into public interest, and be able to perform at a level that those firms need, and to meet a public need out of law school, not just follow the standard Harvard to big law track that has been well worn. So I think that in those two ways, clinical education has just been fantastic for me. Bridges a really important training gap that's developing in big law and public interest. And be happy to talk about that or take other questions about my experience in the clinic later.
Thank you, Chris. I'll just say one thing about Chris, which I think exemplifies his commitment to the client community and his absolute thirst for experience and educational opportunities. Chris was in the Veterans Benefit Project side, so he was doing all litigation. And he was his second semester in the clinic. He had come back to the clinic to take on more, and he was still working on veterans benefit litigation cases. And we had an intake come in from a elderly veteran and his wife, I think, where they had a very complicated situation where they needed a trust created in order to protect certain assets and to ensure the family's stability. And it was 2/3 of the way through the semester. All the students are saturated with work. They're thinking about final exams. Everyone's overloaded. Everyone's just sort of running on fumes in the best kind of way. And our heart went out to this veteran because, like, do we have the capacity to do this? Can we take another case? Can we do it? The students who were focusing on estate planning, they were all maxed out. No one could do it. And we sent sort of an SOS email to the clinic saying, we know you're overloaded. We know you don't have enough time. No one's obligated to be interested or to say yes, but we have this really heart-wrenching case that's going to require the drafting of a complex trust instrument. Any takers? And we knew no one was going to say yes, but we thought we have to ask, and we didn't have the capacity within our staff to take it on. One student said, me. And we said, well, Chris, you're not in the estate planning project. He says, no, I got it. And he worked really carefully with our estate planning instructor and created, it was a trust, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Where he was already doing, you hesitated, so we can talk about this afterwards, because maybe you created something else. He worked with the client and with our estate planning team to do something because he rose to the moment and he answered the call, as he always has. And it just gives you a sense of the incredible energy and enthusiasm of the students. And there are others like Chris, but Chris really stands out for being so nimble and has been a champion of the clinic. In fact, he was the first summer intern in the clinic. The very first summer we had a summer in the clinic, he was our intern. And so I'm glad you got to hear from him. Sara?
Thank you. So I am not a veteran, and I didn't come from a military family, but I married into the military. My husband is active duty Navy. He was a C2 pilot for about 8 years, and then he's now a ROTC instructor in Boston. And so we were together through when he was a ROTC student, going through flight school, 3 deployments, and witnessing everything that he went through and that his buddies went through. I knew that when I got to law school, in some way I wanted to be involved in this community because I felt like, I'm never going to join the military. I'm not going to serve myself, but this is sort of what I can do, sort of, my contribution that I can make to support him and the military in general. So I didn't, like Chris, I didn't really know what clinics were, but there was one experience I had even before I got to law school, before I'd ever heard of clinics, that would have a greater impact later on. I didn't realize it at the time, but we were trying to figure out how to transfer his post 9/11 GI Bill benefits to me so that I could use it to help defray the cost of law school. And we had a kind of complicated timing situation. We weren't really sure how the law applied to our situation, and so he talked to some folks, couldn't get any clarity. I went on the VA's website, and there was conflicting information on the same webpage. I called around. I should mention, I was working for a congressman at the time, and so I was on the Hill, and I went back, I read the statute, couldn't figure it out. I tracked down the person who wrote the law at the law firm where they were working at. I called them at their law firm and asked them, how does this apply to me? And he said, well, are you calling from a congressman's office? Because I can only talk to, congressional staff. I'm like, well, technically I'm sitting in a congressional office, so for the purpose of this, yes, I am, although it's a personal question. And he finally agreed to talk to me and explained it, and we were able to figure it out. That just always stuck with me because I was like, well, what the heck does somebody do if they don't work for a congressman, or they don't have the wherewithal to advocate for themselves and figure this out? So many of our clients, because of any number of issues, medical issues, mental health issues, are not in a good position to be their own advocate, and so it's just incredible to me how much red tape and misinformation we encountered in trying to, get this benefit. And so when I learned about the Veterans Clinic, once I came to Harvard Law School, it just immediately resonated. I knew that was what I wanted to be involved in, and it's just been an incredible experience. Dan was talking about the autonomy that students have to make decisions, and it's absolutely true. One of my colleagues in the clinic and I recently had a case where we had a veteran who had been discharged for a personality disorder, and he was in the Marines. He had done everything that they had asked him to do. He had in fact trained himself and pushed himself so hard in training that he had a serious medical incident, and he got really sick, and as a result he sought mental health treatment. He was stigmatized and harassed and treated so poorly by others in his unit, and they eventually wanted to get him out, and he was sent to see somebody, go talk to another psychologist. He was given a personality disorder. It was a misdiagnosis. It was very clear that was the case, and so we were trying to get this personality disorder removed from his discharge paperwork. And we had a hearing scheduled for months. About a week before we were supposed to go to the hearing, they call and say, they offer us essentially a settlement, that they were giving us not fully what we were asking for, but it was a pretty good deal. But it wasn't clear that there was a right answer. Do we take it? And that's the safe thing. Do we go through with the hearing, or and risk they could take it off the table completely? We could be back to square one. And so it was a really tough call. We went back and forth a lot, and Dan and our other supervisors provided great guidance, but it was really up to us to make the decision, and or really to the client ultimately, but how we were going to talk through the decision and finally come to an answer. And so we eventually did decide to take the settlement, and he was happy with that. But there's definitely you really do you put in that position. It was like maybe 3 weeks into the semester, but I think we were all happy with the outcome. So it's been a fantastic experience. That definitely by far the most rewarding that I've had in law school as a third-year law student. Sometimes staying motivated and getting to class can be a challenge, but you're never going to miss a meeting with a client. We have incredible clients, and it's really an honor to work for them.